you're thinking about some of the things that we've talked about already today, and especially Special Agent Sakella's prior presentation, just think for a minute about the fact that that level of information, high level understanding of some of the threats that are facing every organization, that's directly related to the 056 practice of CMMC, which is understanding the security risks associated with the use of your systems. So even just here today, you received information that will allow you to satisfy specific CMMC practices. Some of the other best practices that were up on the screen just a minute ago, talking about limiting or restricting administrator or privileged use of the system, those are all part of CMMC as well. In fact, all the best practices on that slide are all themselves at least one CMMC practice. So if you start to sort of bring all this together, if I was a defense contractor at this session today, I would count today's session as a training activity, and I would take credit for that in a future assessment. So just something to keep in mind. So for today's discussion, we're really going to be going through the core DFARS requirements that are imposed on all DoD contractors. Now, it's important to understand that from two perspectives. One, obviously, if you're here and you are yourself a defense contractor, you're going to want to know this information because it has direct impacts on your business and your continued ability to do business in the DIB. But then also, we have to consider the fact that if you're a service provider or a third party providing services to one of these DoD contractors, you have to know what's motivating these needs and these activities so that you can respond to them appropriately. So if we get into some of these discussions, at the core of any conversation we have around your existing contractual obligations is always going to be one DFARS contract clause that sort of acts as the hub for any other conversations you're going to have. That clause is DFARS 252-204-7012. Usually it's just called the 7012 clause or the DFARS clause. And the way that this clause is structured it's really all about your overall safeguarding obligations for covered defense information, which is really CUI with additional requirements attached. And then obviously incident reporting for any incidents that have to do with that information. So in this clause, and we're going to go over some of these additional details, you're going to find a requirement for you as the contractor to implement something called NIST Special Publication 800-171, and also the 7012 clause stacks additional requirements on top of that. So this is something that a lot of organizations get hung up on. They start implementing NIST 800-171, they start implementing CMMC, and they don't pay any attention to some of the other safeguarding requirements that are already in DFAR 7012, which then leads them to underscope their effort. So they think they're finished, but they're not. There's also a flow down mechanism that's in the 7012 clause, and so it's really important to know that a lot of times the scope of where you have to apply your protections continues to iterate down through your supply chain. And that's actually one of the biggest X factor risks to organizations' continued ability to contract. They might be able to safeguard things within their own four walls, but then when they're required to do flow downs and receive responses back from subcontractors who might be even smaller than they are or less sophisticated than they are, suddenly their likelihood of being able to get all of their subcontractors to get on board with these requirements continues to go down and down as that flow downs go down. So if we are looking at the overall regulatory landscape here, the 7012 clause has been around for some time. It was required to be in all DoD contracts somewhere in 2017. So pretty much any new DoD contract that comes out today is going to have that clause in it by requirement. It's there in case it's needed, in case the data that requires protection happens to be in that contract. Now, selectively, we're starting to see new DFARS contract clause roll out. This is the 252-204-7020 clause. Now, you're going to know that this clause will be in your contract award because in addition to this clause, there's also a provision that goes out in all the sources sought publications or in any RFIs or RFQs that are out there requesting bid responses. That is the 252-204-7019 provision. And it says, hey, if you're going to bid on this contract, when you get this contract, you're going to get 7020 in your award. So it's good to know that those two work in tandem with each other. So the 7020 clause requires that in order for you to be able to actually catch this contract and do the work, you have to actually have already submitted your self-assessment for 800-171 implementation to SPRS. So if you're not familiar with SPRS or SPRS, that's the Supplier Performance Risk System that the DoD maintains. So DoD acquisition personnel can go into that database, they can look at your score, and they can understand whether or not they're going to use that as a source selection criteria to give you the award, or just as a technical evaluation factor, or if it's going to be a non-starter to even consider you because your score is too low. There's no formal government-wide guidance on how to necessarily use SPRS scores to make those decisions. That happens at a program level or down at the acquisition personnel KO level. But just be aware of this. We're talking about CMMC because it's one of the more broadly publicized aspects of CUI safeguarding right now in the DIB. Way more people are going to be put out of business by the requirements of 7020 over the next 5 years than CMMC. And that's just because of how easy it is for contracting officers today to include the 7020 requirements, either in new contracts or any renewal of an existing contract you've already got that contains 7012. So think about the low friction way that this can be utilized by program managers and contract officers and primes compared to maybe some of the more stringent rules that are in place to allow the use of 7021, which is our CMMC clause. So again, the 7020 clause requires you to have done a self-assessment against everything that's required of you in 7012. It's a self-assessment right now requiring an upload to SPRS, but you just have to keep in mind that the 7020 clause, as soon as you get that award, you're automatically enrolled or required to make yourself available to the DoD for their own assessments of you. So this won't be a self-assessment. This will be either a moderate confidence assessment put on by DCMA and their DIBCAC teams, or it'll be a high confidence, which means they're coming on site. And in either of those scenarios, you're assigned an SPRS score at that point. You didn't get to come up with your own. A team of assessors comes and lives with you for probably about a week, and they figure out what your score is going to be. So the good news is that it's a high confidence score. The bad news is if you were being very gracious in your own self-assessment, your numbers could change drastically as a result of that. And again, the 7020 flows down as well to subcontracts. Now, the 7021 clause is actually the contract clause that mandates a CUI certification level in order for you to be able to receive that contract award. So this is where CMMC comes into the contracting space. Again, the 7021 clause right now is only being considered for inclusion in a contract if DoD acquisition and sustainment green lights a particular contract. So we're still quite a ways away from this being just an, oh, by the way, in one of your new awards. You will absolutely need to know that this is coming in an upcoming opportunity, because if you don't have the certification already at the time of award, you're not eligible to receive the award. So it's all moot. So again, the CMMC requirements are really just third-party verification that you are doing everything that's in 800-171, plus any additional process maturity requirements or add-on practices that are in the CMMC model itself. So a lot of people ask, like, why does CMMC need to exist? Well, in the National Defense Authorization Act from a couple of years back, there's already congressional mandate that the DoD implements some verification and assessment method for contractors' ability to safeguard CUI. Right now, the two ways that that's being done is going to be through CMMC and then also through those DIBCAC assessments that we mentioned. Both of those programs are going to scale, and there's no easy way right now to determine which one is going to impact you first. So as long as we're aware that both are happening in tandem, we can plan for either. So 7020 and 7021 will both become a part of your reality in the future. And again, the 7021 clause also flows down. So just keep in mind the differences here. 7021, if that starts to become included in your contracts, when that comes in the front door, you're supposed to do a flow down to your subcontractors based on the sensitivity level of the data that you're actually giving them. Which means that if I'm only flowing information down to my subcontractors that's not meeting the definitions of CUI, it's simply information that's just not cleared for public release. Maybe it's basic procurement data or a statement of work or something like that. That's going to be federal contract information, or FCI. So I would still flow down the 7021 clause. I just would specify a lower CMMC requirement for that subcontractor, which means like I could have to have a level 3 cert, but depending on the data I send, my subcontractor might only need a level 1 cert. So real quick, any questions on the clause structure that we have up here before we dive into what's actually in DFAR 7012, what safeguarding looks like, all of those things? We're good? Yes, sir. We'll give you a second just for the mic to get over to you. How often do you update your SPRS score? Well, if we think about the way that you upload your SPRS score, when you actually go and create that score, you're reporting it at a different scope, and it's one that you choose. So you're either reporting an overall score for your entire enterprise, you're reporting a score for a limited isolated system, an enclave, or you're reporting it for just a contract. So depending on how you chose to scope your response, that might require more upkeep, right? So if I've got a particular contract and I'm just reporting our ability to safeguard the data on that contract, I might need to change that score or take that score out of the system once that contract is finished. I would definitely recommend updating your score anytime your score changes because of additional implementations that you've put in place. So if you've got, let's say right now, an SPRS score of -80, and you're actively looking to move that score up into positive territory, you're obviously going to want to report on that as frequently as you can. If you're already in the 100s or something like that, and you're just putting the finishing touches on getting all the way to 110, you might not be under as much pressure to make those updates. But ultimately, anytime your score impacted score changes, you're going to want to update it in SPRS. So when we look at DFAR 7012, that core clause, there are multiple paragraphs that are in that clause itself, but only some of them really describe actions that we need to take as a contractor. So we've got some groupings here. The first grouping that we have is just paragraph B, and that's our requirements for adequate security. So at first blush, you might be glancing through paragraph B, and you'll see the mention of NIST 800-171 and say, okay, I get it. I put 800-171 in place for my systems, we're good to go. But there are more things specified in paragraph B, and so we have to be aware of that. So when we're running through this, the first thing we need to do in paragraph A is look at how a covered contractor information system is defined. So when we look at the definition of a covered contractor information system, it's any system that stores, processes, or transmits controlled unclassified information, or as it's defined by the DoD, covered defense information, which is really just CUI in a DoD contract. So if we're looking at that definition, that is the scope per DoD agencies where you apply NIST 800-171. Now, there's been a lot of discussion on this recently because on the CMMC side of the world, we don't have a scoping guide for exactly where CMMC will be assessed. It's apparently going to be available soon. But when we read the original document used to build CMMC, which is NIST 800-171, it has scoping determinations in the document. It says that NIST 800-171 and its requirements, those are written to be applied to two types of things. The first is covered contractor information systems. So what we're talking about right now, a system that stores, processes, or transmits the data that needs to be protected. And 800-171 can also be applied to the systems that provide security for those covered systems. Now, one of the things that we're really interested to see where CMMC scoping may be the same or different from what we see here in DFAR 7012 is that DFAR 7012 only tells us to apply 800-171 requirements to covered contractor information systems. And when we talk to DoD contractors who have been through DIBCAC assessments, the absolute focus that they're reporting back is that the assessors are interested in the covered systems, and as soon as they're able to understand how those systems are secured, they're only interested in the other systems that provide security in as much as they actually need to in talking through requirements. So If I've got to talk about your vulnerability scanning platform just to understand what it does for your covered systems, we'll talk about that. But I'm maybe not as interested as an assessor in how you're specifically applying all of the 800-171 requirements to your vulnerability scanner. Does that make sense as far as two different buckets that systems can be sorted in? Do we have any questions on that? Okay, so just so that everyone understands, there's two different possible scopes where you can apply NIST 800-171, but contractually, the way that DoD is laying this out, they're mostly focused on the covered contractor information systems. That's where 800-171 needs to be applied at a minimum. So the reason that we can't just say do 800-171 is because paragraph B also has some other definitions of adequate security. The other main area that we need to understand is how we provide adequate security for cloud systems. So as cloud systems go, the way that paragraph B is written is that if you're going to put CUI in a cloud system, where now you're storing, processing, transmitting CUI in the cloud, that cloud system, it's not good enough that you've just done NIST 800-171. The cloud system needs to have security that's equivalent, and equivalent is a very weighted term, to something called the FedRAMP moderate baseline. That is a baseline of NIST 853 controls applied to cloud systems. And that's actually more controls than you would need to satisfy 800-171 requirements. So we just need to be aware that that is required. Now when we say FedRAMP equivalent, it's a very ubiquitous term. What exactly are we talking about there? Well, the DoD doesn't seem to know either. The DoD coined the term FedRAMP equivalent back when most civilian businesses couldn't even buy FedRAMP products from the FedRAMP marketplace. It was originally just created for agencies to utilize and consume. So they didn't really have a way to require FedRAMP moderate for cloud systems. So instead they say just kind of be equivalent to it. If there's a security control that's described for implementation in the FedRAMP moderate baseline, have something that looks like that in your implementation in the cloud. Now, this is where, and as Richard from Microsoft could tell you, this is where there's a lot of documentation on these topics. You just have to pull it all together into a cohesive worldview and then figure out what's left over for you to do. So one of the good things about the cloud is that cloud providers can actually implement controls for you on your behalf in their service, and they will document that in a controls implementation summary, and then they'll tell you if there's anything left over to do in what's called the customer responsibility matrix. If you participate in the FedRAMP program, you're required to have these documents. So these aren't optional for FedRAMP listed services. So you can go into those services and say, okay, physical security as an example. It says here in the FedRAMP requirement that I have to have physical safeguards that prevent access into the building where the data lives, and I have to have guards. Well, I'm looking at Microsoft's implementation. They do that, right? They've got man traps, they've got passback protection systems, they've got guards, they've got cameras. Well, then I go look at the customer responsibility matrix and there's nothing there for me to do. Why? Well, because Microsoft has already satisfied that FedRAMP moderate requirement for where the data is actually living in the cloud. So I don't have any additional work to do there. In other topics, I might actually have a remaining area of responsibility where I still have some work to do. I just need to know what that is. So I don't want people to be scared off because the cloud has more security controls required for equivalency, because in a lot of cases, some of those controls have already been satisfied for you. So it's really just a comparison exercise to see how much of the work is still left over for me to do, and is that body of work more or less work than if I was to build it all on site. So any questions about the differences between on-prem systems requiring 800-171 versus things that are in the cloud requiring FedRAMP moderate equivalency? I must just be doing just a world-beating job of explaining this. If you do have any questions later that percolate to the top, just raise your hand. So when we get into the next grouping of DFARS paragraph requirements, we're dealing with paragraphs C through G. These are grouped together because they all talk about how organizations respond to incidents that actually impact either a covered system or CDI itself, covered defense information. Now, in order to be able to even participate in the requirements in this paragraph, we have to be able to actually submit reports of incidents to the DoD. The DoD has a system for that. So the Defense Cybercrime Center, DC3, they operate a platform called DibNet. It's a reporting portal where you as a contractor go to submit your incident report. One caveat, in order to be able to even log into DibNet, you have to have a digital certificate issued to you, a person working at your company. So these digital medium assurance certificates, you would normally get those from a vendor. I believe the two that issue these are WidePoint and IdenTrust. So you can go grab those from either of those vendors. Just so you know, this is a notarized process. This is issued to you. You have to go get your ID notarized on the application and mail it in, and then they mail you a digital certificate. So if we're thinking about that, if I've only got 72 hours to report an incident and I don't already have this cert, there's no chance I'm getting the certificate in place in time to fill out my report. So if I truly want to comply with these requirements, I need that digital certificate at the ready. So when you fill out one of these reports, again, we've got 72 hours per paragraph C to report it from the time of discovery. I'll let the security nerds argue about whether something being logged in your system counts as discovery or whether a person laying eyes on that log and seeing the alert counts as discovery. But in either case, once you're in a position to know that something has happened, you're going to want to get that report into the DibNet system within 72 hours, which means if I'm a defense contractor, I probably need to know what the heck is happening within 24 hours so that I can start staging and preparing what's going to go into that report. Now, just to be clear, there's a lot of fields that you filled out in a standard DoD incident report. That template's available on the DibNet site. That report does not have to be complete. You just need to put in everything you know at this point, 72 hours in, and submit that. Then you can work back on adding the additional detail. If DoD feels that they need additional detail from you, these remaining paragraphs explain how they're going to ask for that detail, what you should have available, what information and evidence you should retain and collect. So all of the logs about the environment, the original malware that was involved, images of the infected or impacted systems, all of that. Now, when we get through, and I think I've got, so malware submissions, paragraph D, you're actually going to figure out what the malware was and make that available to DC3 for additional analysis. Now, just to be clear, DC3 does not want you sending them malware. Like, here you go, check this out. They don't want to open it and then also have the same threat manifested in their environment. You're gonna maintain it, and if they ask you for it, you're gonna submit it at that point. Paragraph E is all about the media preservation, so system images and things like that. If you're not in a position to image systems and hold on to the data, that probably means that you've got to take that infected machine out of commission and set it aside during the 90-day investigation period, and then clean it up, factory reset it, put it back into production after that period passes, because otherwise you're not going to have retained evidence. So just be aware of that. That could cause some business disruptions. If you don't have what I call like a +1 computer or a laptop where your organization is planning to rotate that into production so that you can rotate something out and hold on to it for evidence, you probably don't have all the tools you need to actually do what's described in these paragraphs. Now, paragraph F is where things can get really dicey for organizations, and this is where we need to do some risk analysis. So paragraph F says that the DoD is entitled to any additional forensics information that they need to understand what happened in the incident, and that includes access to equipment. So if you talk to the folks at Microsoft, they will actually support these requirements for the DoD if needed. A lot of cloud providers, when they read that their equipment could potentially go with the DoD investigator to a lab, they're no longer interested in hosting your COI, because now you're introducing impacts and risks into their ability to provide services. If my multi-tenant host that I'm running your junk on also has 4,000 other customers on it, I'm not going to want to lose that piece of equipment to forensic analysis, so I don't want your data. So in those types of situations, we have to know that cloud providers are actually on board with all these requirements. Otherwise, we shouldn't be putting the data there. The other thing that we should think about is that if my equipment as a business is subject to additional forensic analysis, chances are the Defense Cybercrime Center, which doesn't have a huge team, they're not going to come live with me in my facility for a week or two to figure out what happened. they're gonna send someone to grab the gear and take it back to the lab. So if I'm gonna lose that equipment, I have to ask myself, can I even afford to lose that equipment to a damage assessment? If I only have one firewall running the whole business, and I could lose that firewall to a forensic assessment, should I be using just one firewall to operate my entire organization, or should I have a contingency plan for being able to fail over to something that's more resilient? Paragraph G is really just about continued support of the DoD and DC3 throughout the entire damage assessment process. So if you had an incident, you reported it, you need to be available, you have to return DC3's calls when they have questions. So it's just a general availability requirement. Now, the final substantive requirement that's in DFAR 7012 is the last paragraph that's in the clause. Paragraph M, this has to do with subcontracts. For a lot of organizations, if they're not really paying attention to the entirety of DFAR 7012, this is the one that will sneak up on you. So paragraph M basically states that if I am going to receive CDI or create it in my contract, and then that data needs to go to a third party for a subcontracting arrangement, the original contractor, I have to include the entirety of the 7012 clause in that subcontract, which means that the protection requirements that I'm putting in place for myself internally have to follow the data down through the subcontracted supply chain. And that's important because obviously, as we were talking about a few minutes ago, if my subcontractor isn't in a position to safeguard covered defense information, they're not going to be in a position to meet or satisfy all the requirements that I'm about to flow down to them. So if we're going to make sure that the liability lives with the data as it flows, we have to do these flow downs. So that should immediately strike up a conversation within most defense contractors. Are my subcontractors even mature enough to safeguard this data the way that it's required? What are some alternate ways that I could provide access to data where my subcontractors don't necessarily have covered contractor systems of their own? How can I get creative with that to preserve my supply chain as it is? So if I'm going to do a flow down to my subcontractor, assuming they actually read the 7012 clause, they would be required to tell me if they've got what's called any planned variances where they're not going to meet 800-171. So that could be anything from I'm not going to do it, in which case, hey, I can't send you the data, to, hey, we do everything that's in NIST 800-171, which, by the way, is also in CMMC Level 3. But, hey, for this one area, we don't implement this requirement, and here's why. That and here's why is going to be a documented exemption from the DoD CIO's office. So I'll give you a couple of quick examples. If the area where I protect and isolate CUI doesn't have any mobile devices, then I don't have anything to implement when I get to the 800-171 and CMMC requirements for mobile devices. The condition that requirement was written for doesn't exist. I have nothing to do. Therefore, I would tell the DoD CIO's office that I don't have mobile devices in my environment. They would respond back and say, if that's true, then you don't have anything to do. And I would take that email response and I would show that to my prime contractor when they send me my 7012 flow down. Another example would be like if I've got, what we were talking about, mobile devices, if I've got wireless networks, but I don't actually have wireless networks in my CUI environment. So that means that connecting to my Wi-Fi network just gives me internet and I've still got a VPN into the CUI environment. Well, then the wireless networks aren't actually giving out any CUI access. They're over there. They're just a dumb pipe routing packets that they can't see inside of. So I would make that argument, and then DoD would respond back with either a yay or nay, and I would keep that exemption on file. So those are the things that you can do to actually trim down and limit some of the requirements. If the condition that's described in the requirement doesn't exist in your environment, you don't have to do it as long as you inform the DoD CIO's office and they agree. So if I'm a subcontractor, yes, sir. These exemptions are in addition to the POAM? Yeah, these exemptions are saying you don't have to do this like at all. There's nothing to put on your plan of action. It's not an unimplemented requirement. It's a non-applicable requirement. So there is a difference there. So that means that I could potentially only have to implement 107 of the 110 requirements or something like that because I have planned variances that have been approved by the DoD CIO for the other X number of requirements. So the other thing that we have to be aware of is that if I'm a subcontractor and I have an incident, like we just talked about, paragraph C through G, I'm going to get an incident report number from DC3. It's my responsibility to inform the prime who gave me that data originally that an incident took place that involved their data. So I have to tell my prime. So if I'm the one who's a DoD contractor and I'm working with a sub, they would have to tell me. I then tell my prime if the data came from them. So if I'm just a flow through for this data, the notification of an incident has to keep going up the chain until it gets to the original data owner, which is usually an agency at some point. So that's another mechanism that's built into paragraph M. So if I'm just thinking in my mind, DFAR 7012 equals NIST 800-171, and I don't see all of these other high watermarks for performance built into the requirements here, I'm going to struggle to implement things that satisfy all of my requirements across the board. That's actually some of the things we're going to talk about in this afternoon session, which is, a lot of these requirements that are in 7012 or that are in FedRAMP moderate equivalency or these other areas that we're already bound to, they happen to look a lot like the things that are added into CMMC level 3, both at a process maturity level and also at a practice level. So when we look at CMMC, it might feel new, but there's really not a lot there that we weren't already required to do through these mechanisms that already exist. So with that in mind, any questions on DFAR 7012 itself, which is sort of the mothership clause for all of the other things that are happening in industry, from self-assessment to certification and all of that good stuff? We good? Okay. Well, if any other questions jump into mind as a result of any of the other conversations that we're going to be having throughout the day, obviously feel free to track one of us down. We'll get you answers to your questions. But that's our high-level walkthrough of the DFARS requirements.